Welcome to the Hungarian Grand Prix episode of the Motorsport Show as we record yet another sensational drive from the world champion Lewis Hamilton. Mercedes weren't supposed to win in Hungary, so Monaco-like is its corner range, but that was before it rained in qualifying. Lewis Hamilton took the pole, as great drivers do when the conditions even up the variables, and then won from the front with teammate Valtteri Bottas brilliantly playing a supportive defensive role. Ferrari were reduced to a 2-3 finish on a track on which they should have won, and Stuart Codling, executive editor of the Motorsport Group, is with me in the studio to analyse the race. Craig Scarborough has your tech updates, and we talk to one of the brightest stars on the Formula One grid, Esteban Ocon. Before we start though, have a look at these two other pieces of action from the weekend. Tommy Mäkinen's running of the factory Toyota World Rally Championship team has been coming in for a bit of flack this year, but on home soil last weekend in the Rally of Finland, it was Ott Tänak and the Yaris virtually all the way, with local hero Jari-Matti Latvala making it a 1-3 for Toyota. And if you'd have to pick a venue at which Michael Schumacher's talented son Mick was going to win his first big Formula 3 race, where would you go? To Spa maybe? Perhaps throw in a bit of light rain while you're about it? That's right. In classic family tradition, Mick Schumacher not only took his maiden pole at Spa last Friday, but also scored his first win after a fast run out of Eau Rouge, gave him a lead he was never to lose. Back though to Hungary, where the GP3 races are won by the rapidly rising Russian Nikita Mazepin and the flamboyant Frenchman Dorian Boccolacci, and the Formula 2 races by the former McLaren star of the future, Nick de Vries, who in the Saturday feature beat out today's McLaren wonder kid, Lando Norris. Nice bit of irony there. And on Sunday, by the excellent Alexander Albon of Dans. ART's George Russell was sidelined before the start, but drove brilliantly from the back of the grid in race 2 to finish 8th. In Saturday afternoon's race 1, also at the back, George had the presence of mind on the wet track to ask if the onboard of Lewis Hamilton's pole lap had been published, and if so, could someone tell him what Lewis was doing in the wet and where he was doing it? I think George's reference to Lewis's pole lap, actually there's two aspects to that. One is it kind of comes under the heading of why isn't Lewis Hamilton given a bit more attention? Because they didn't actually show his pole lap on the world feed, which is why George was saying, have you seen the onboard yet? Because I've got to see what lines to take. And secondly, it shows how George uses his brain. And thirdly, I guess if you wanted to add a third one, how good that lap was. And we're putting this in the context of maybe his wet pole at Monza last year. And it defined the weekend. This was a Ferrari circuit, a Ferrari win there for the taking. And it all came down to that qualifying lap of Lewis Hamilton's. Or actually, the qualifying lap not put in by Sebastian Vettel.
Exactly, Peter. And it's weird in the context of Hungary kind of no longer being a Grand Prix that's won from pole. I think the statistics, it's only 5 in the past 13 years have been won from pole. So it's much more competitive than it used to be regarded as. And yet, really, Lewis sewed it up in qualifying. Wet conditions in F1. It's amazing how few people see it coming. Look at the sky, rain clouds, Hamilton at his best.
And I think in a way it was perhaps a better lap than his Monza pole in the wet, because Hungary's such a technical circuit. It's full of chicanes and slow corners. So where is a guy like Lewis going to get an advantage over a Sebastian Vettel or a Valtteri Bottas? And if you look at the overhead of his lap, you can see that it's on the medium speed corners where he's using all the grip on the outside. Easy to say that's the racing line, do it. But actually, I did it once actually. It was Carlos Reutemann in the wet at Brands using the outside of the circuit. And it's one thing to think you're going to take the outside line. It's another thing to brake to the point of the turn-in to the outside line. That is spooky, and that is a very different thing. And the way Lewis is able to float the car into that wide line on the outside was what gave him the pole, in my view. Obviously very good around sector 3, which was the part of the lap that you needed to be really on, the tyres perfect. But Sebastian Vettel saying after qualifying, well, I'm not that upset, we had a few problems, maybe the car's not that great in the wet. Well, it's not as if Mercedes have any more wet weather practice than Ferrari. So what was going on with Sebastian Vettel there? That's where the race was lost, in effect.
I think that he probably wasn't really good enough. And I know that's a bit of a...
That's why we have you.
It's a heretical thing to say of someone who's shooting for a fifth world title.
And I haven't put you up to that one, but I would add, if there's a difference between Lewis Hamilton and Sebastian Vettel, maybe it's in the wet, in crosswind, and maybe when there's not so much grip at the rear of the car, Lewis is able to do more with the car then. These are all areas where Lewis is so good, where we saw he was so good against Nico, for example. And if that's the case, Sebastian still has work to do on his own driving. And just to say, well, it was tricky conditions, I'm not too unhappy to be on the second row, isn't enough. That doesn't cut it when you've got a car as good as a Ferrari that should have won the Hungarian Grand Prix. And then Lewis of course, they could have lost the race, Mercedes. It was dry, it was hot. We knew they were using more from their tyres and it was going to be difficult. They had to make great starts, and obviously they had to have reliability. And guess what? They both made great starts. And we shouldn't actually forget that Valtteri out-qualified both Ferrari drivers in the wet as well, and that was an important move. And we'll get onto that perhaps later on in the show as to why the Mercedes had such a good sweet spot, or had such a sweet spot in the wet compared with the Red Bulls and the Ferraris. But beyond that, they both made good starts. And then it became the race of the number twos. And Valtteri, I don't know whether you would agree with this, but Valtteri brilliantly protected Lewis going into the first corner. And then with obviously Sebastian with a pre-planned move to go around the outside of Kimi at turn 2, Valtteri made it absolutely sure that there's no way Vettel was going to get a run on him out of turn 2 into 3, and that was a beautiful part of the race in terms of drivers just using the right bits of road and doing it correctly.
For me, Hungary is one of the most challenging opening laps because it's not just a case of turn 1 being where it all kicks off, because it can carry on kicking off all the way down to turn 3, as we saw later in the race with Bottas and Vettel. The other thing that interested me about this Grand Prix was how quickly Ferrari decided to, in effect, burn Raikkonen to try and take Bottas out of the equation, to try and lure Mercedes into following what was basically not much of a strategy.
Let's talk about Sebastian Vettel now, because putting aside his disappointing qualifying, I have to say, he actually drove the perfect race, because Mercedes would have been very worried at how long he was making those tyres last. And it was pretty clear by half distance that he was going to go to the ultra soft for the final stint of the race, which meant that the pressure was mounting as it went along. And Sebastian basically did everything perfectly, except that he couldn't get past Valtteri Bottas, which means that in reality, Bottas drove maybe the best race of his career, because he had a perfectly positioned Sebastian Vettel on a great set of tyres, using the strategy that he wanted to use to maximise his situation. And yet he could not pass Valtteri Bottas. Yeah. Full marks to Valtteri.
Let's take those two impacts out of the equation and focus on the positives about Bottas. He really, really did make that final set of tyres last longer than probably they could have done. Well, he was out of rear tyres by the end, so he did very well to hold position. And as a sort of corollary of that, Vettel, I think, I wouldn't give him a perfect 10, because when he actually
because of qualifying.
Yeah, well, not just that, but also in the race it wasn't perfect, because when he did make that move, there was almost a touch of desperation about it, so that when he pinched in at turn 3, he came in, what I would say, a little bit too early, especially if you knew that you had a driver who was desperate to keep that position right behind you. I don't know, maybe at the moment of impact he was thinking, I wish Formula One would pay attention to Peter Windsor and fit these cars with rear-facing cameras instead of mirrors. I can't see how to.
Yeah, no, it's a good point. Although, of course, it didn't actually hurt the Ferrari. That was the interesting one. It was a bit of an impact, but it didn't affect Seb's pace, did it? And yeah, Seb was obviously pretty desperate at that point and did come in unnecessarily tight there. And he didn't make allowances for the fact that Valtteri just had to be there, as much as Kimi was there on the first lap at the British Grand Prix when Lewis was around. It's not having them off, it's just being there and being there as much as possible.
We should also, before we move on from that incident, talk about Raikkonen's role in it, which was to see it coming and position himself almost perfectly on the right-hand side, and almost brake a little bit early, just because he thought, this is going to kick off, I need to be in a position to nip through any gap and accelerate into it when it does kick off. And unfortunately, it didn't come out for him.
What about that incident late in the race between Valtteri and Daniel Ricciardo?
What interested me about it was watching on one channel where Christian Horner was being interviewed live and inadvertently dropped the F-bomb as he was invited to commentate on the manoeuvre as it happened, because he could see it happening, I'd say, like half a second before he knew that when Daniel went round the outside, he said, oh, he's going the long way round, and you could almost hear the cogs ticking in his brain as if to think, understeer, 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 oh, there it goes.
But this is a little bit like interviewing golfers in the middle of a match, which they do sometimes, and inevitably the next hole they always get a bogey. Should Christian Horner be doing that? Because my question is, did Daniel know that Valtteri had that damage on the left front wing? Because really, if that has happened, you don't pass a guy on the outside, because you know he's potentially going to have a lot of understeer, which is exactly what happened.
it would be remiss of the team not to tell him that the car ahead was impaired.
But did they just say front wing or left front wing? Because that was the critical thing. And it's unlike Daniel to make such a mistake. It's not a mistake. It was obviously the fault lies with Bottas, and correctly he was given some sort of penalty. But in terms of track craft, if a guy's got, like Bottas, who's going to be difficult to pass, has got a broken left front wing, why would you go to the outside on a right-hander? It doesn't make any sense at all. You'd go down the safe side on the inside. Now let's move on to Pierre Gasly, P6. Very good in qualifying, even better in the race. And his driving getting better and better all the time, as it would. But beyond that, let's see this again in the context of the Toro Rosso Honda beating the McLaren Renault fair and square. But not beating them, actually thrashing them. On a day when McLaren felt they did a pretty good job with the strategy and brought Fernando home in the top 10, nowhere near Pierre Gasly.
Yeah, that's picking a little bit of historic scab, isn't it, to bring up the Honda thing. But yeah, the Toro Rosso does seem to give its drivers the option of being gentle on their tyres. We saw Pierre do a really long stint in Monaco on the softest possible tyre without it giving up on him. And to be able to do that just opens up all sorts of tactical possibilities.
The other drive, I thought, was Stoffel Van Dorn. And for Stoffel, this was a weekend where he looked just about as good as Fernando Alonso in everything he did. Didn't qualify quite as well, but made up for it with a great start. And in the race, they looked the mirror image of one another. And when Daniel Ricciardo came up to pass them, it was just as difficult for him to pass Stoffel as it was to pass Fernando. And that says quite a lot about Stoffel, I think. Which is a good thing, because at the moment, as we understand it, he's not flavour of the month at McLaren, and they're saying they don't really like him or want him. But to me, this is a drive that we should remember. He did very well in Hungary.
I think McLaren really ought to stand by their man here, because it seems to me that through, I don't know what they did with the car change, they gave him a new chassis, so we can't really say for sure if there was anything wrong with the previous one, but it does seem to have unlocked some more capacity in Stoffel. He didn't seem to struggle anywhere near as much as he did through practice and qualifying as he had in previous rounds. And he really, as you say, matched Alonso stroke for stroke and would have been there banking a points finish if his gearbox hadn't given out in the closing lap.
Red Bull for a while in practice looked very quick in Hungary, but faded in the race. Craig Scarborough has more. Okay, let's begin with the Red Bull updates.
Well, we've seen some updates to the car over the recent races, front flaps, the floor and everything. For Hungary, as you would expect, all the winglets have been added back on. Obviously, they've been trying to run low drag as much as they can this year. So if we slip round and look straight at the rear end, you can see that they've got both a monkey seat and a T-wing added to the rear of the car. Other teams have run these as well. Both of these, they kind of tried to ban these over the winter with some changes to the regulations, but still left a few little areas. So if we first of all look at the monkey seat, you can see it's much smaller than what it used to be. It's directly above the exhaust, but its function's very much the same. It's to create some upwash under the rear wing, helps work the exhaust into an upwash as well, just keeps all the airflow attached to the rear wing. So it's not adding downforce directly, but making that rear wing work better when it's at really steep angles of attack. And then we move on. Again, the T-wing didn't have these high ones like we had last year, but there's still space, as you can see here, for most teams run them. Very low down, single T-wing, and again, that's just working the airflow into the rear wing area to get it to work with the diffuser. Now, some other teams came with T-wings as well, notably Williams and Force India, and they had this tiny bit of space allowed. They've got 4 elements there, all stacked up, acting as wings. Gives you quite dirty downforce, lots of drag come with these. Red Bulls is much like Ferraris and the Mercedes ones, which is angled down slightly, so it's more about making the rear wing work than creating direct downforce.
And how Hungary specific or high downforce specific are these monkey seats and T-wings? Are we going to see them anywhere else, do you think?
Yeah, we'll see them at a few more races. So we've got a few low drag races
Singapore
coming up. Belgium obviously won't be anything like that there. But yes, you've got the high downforce of Singapore and potentially Abu Dhabi as well, depending on how the cars are set up, how the power units are performing for them.
It was a strange weekend for Red Bull. They started as we predicted that they would be very quick around Hungary, and then it kind of faded away. By the time they got to qualifying in the wet, they were struggling for tyre temperature and grip, and that really showed with Max's qualifying lap, and Daniel had a few other issues. In the race, he was kind of where he needed to be, I guess, if you're going to run a very long stint. But what do you think about that qualifying lap? Because you would imagine the high rate car, massive downforce, Max Verstappen and Daniel would have been right on it in the wet, but they just fell away.
With the wet tyres, the key thing that you need is you need lots of downforce, you need lots of temperature. And what we've found is actually, you know, some of the weaknesses that we may perceive in the Mercedes and then the Ferrari and then the Red Bull are actually what worked against themselves and actually gave it an advantage.
Interesting, isn't it? Yeah.
It is, and just shows you how finely balanced we are with the tyres.
So what are we talking here? That because Mercedes don't have as much downforce, they have to work harder to get the tyres to work temperature-wise, and that put them in the sweet spot for the wet, whereas Red Bull, even more than Ferrari, have so much downforce that they have to demand less from the tyres, and it actually didn't work for them in the wet.
Exactly. We would have expected Mercedes to have gone off during the race with blistering and hot tyres. Obviously, they got pole, so they could manage things.
Yeah.
So, first of all, we know that Mercedes works its tyres very hard. We know it works really well on the harder compounds in comparison to other people. Often they can be as quick on a harder compound because the whole car is working the tyre much harder. And this is down to the amount of downforce they've got, but equally it's also down to how they set the suspension up, both in its geometry and the damping. So it's not so much that the camber of the tyres or the toe of the tyres is different when the car's sat there in the pit lane, but how that changes, how aggressively that changes, how much energy goes into the tyre. That works against you in the dry because it gives you too much temperature and you wear your tyres out, you blister the tyres. In the wet, that's what you want. So Mercedes' issue, and we obviously saw this going back in Germany, working the tyres too hard was a benefit and got them wets working really well. Conversely, Red Bull, very easy on its tyres. We saw in the race how far they could run on these tyres.
And then Ferrari kind of in the middle.
And they're kind of in the middle.
Maybe slightly less grip, but great balance. And they had quite a lot of grip, more than Red Bull, which is why Kimi was saying the car felt so good.
Yeah.
But Lewis on the pole in the Mercedes.
And Lewis on the pole.
Valtteri P2, you know, that was the other
Exactly.
impressive thing.
You know, the Mercedes was the car in the wet, as we saw at the back end of the German Grand Prix. And this can also come down slightly to aerodynamics. So we talk about the downforce level, which is one factor, but obviously the teams will play with that anyway. But in the wet, obviously the air is denser, you've got the humidity, you've got the physical rain, both in the air and on the track surface. Now, we know that Ferrari and Red Bull in particular, run lots of rake. And when you look at that, in theory, you think that should make the car run much better in the wet because so much of the floor is well away from the surface. But the very leading edge of the plank and the splitter that's kind of underneath the driver's legs projecting out under the car runs right on the track. So you have to wonder, is there an aerodynamic effect there where either it's picking the rain up and directing it into areas that are quite sensitive, or is it literally sealing against the track surface, against that surface water, preventing the air passing and actually partially stalling or disrupting the airflow under the floor? Mercedes run much flatter and they'll get some of that effect, and we know that they run very low. But when you see the car, particularly in the dry, both the Ferrari and the Red Bull sparking the front edge of that splitter all of the time. And this is one of these things that you can't really simulate. You can't put rain in the wind tunnel.
I was going to say, how much simulation can they do for the rain effect?
All they can do is probably full-scale testing, which are, you know, any full-scale testing on track in the wet is going to be hard to produce. You can't do it in the wind tunnel, obviously. You can't just sit there filling it with water. And the same with CFD. It's like, what conditions exactly are you replicating? So this is just one of those odd situations where they've got something that works for the majority of the time, but in those few situations when we do have wet conditions, they just seem to lose more performance relative to Mercedes in particular.
There was a strange, chaotic feel to the Hungarian Grand Prix, so in many ways it's a good thing that school's out for the August break and everyone can now take stock. That certainly applies to Force India, the fourth-ranked Formula One team for the past 2 years, but a team which now, very sadly, finds itself in administration. If that doesn't say everything that needs to be said about the effect of the declining Formula One pay TV audience, the horrendous costs of running a Formula One team, and the consequent impossibility of raising genuine large sponsorship deals, then I don't know what does. For teams with poor results, we should have less concern because results should be rewarded. But when a team as good as Force India can't generate the backing it deserves, then everyone in the industry should be worried. Some sort of budget cap is a short-term fix for the entire grid. Much more urgent, in my view, is a major change to the regulations, one that would allow teams to have the option of buying a car like a Dallara rather than having to design and build prototypes at vast expense. That, though, is for another day. In the meantime, I spoke recently to one of the key men in today's Force India team, very talented, and now the very sought-after Esteban Ocon. And yes, before you send in your comments, it was a bad day for hay fever. My eyes were a mess. That's the shades.
I had a strong first season. Of course, I was happy with how I progressed over last season, and this year I feel like I still improved very much on the beginning of the year. I had to improve a lot on qualifying, and that's what I've been working on, and I was happy with my performance I've done so far in quali, and also the car is progressing, so I'm pretty happy with my position so far.
And a beautiful drive at Monaco.
Thank you. Yeah, that was quite something. A bit unexpected it was, but yeah, I managed to put a good lap in Q3, and yeah, P6 was a great satisfaction. Always in Monaco, when you do a lap, you're happy with the outcome.
Top of the hill into Casino, you look right on top of the car.
Was it?
Yeah,
you were there watching?
Yeah, you looked as if you were really enjoying yourself there.
Yeah, I was, and the car was feeling great. On the low speed corner, I think we maximized the potential of it. And yeah, I was feeling just confident to push it. If you're not confident and you don't feel one with the car there, yeah, you go in the back.
When you say the improvements you've made improvements in qualifying, can you go a little bit deeper into that? Is that a psychological thing, how you build yourself up to qualifying? Is it a tyre warming up thing? Is it a setup thing? What is it?
There is a bit of setup, different philosophy that I understood how to go quick in qualifying, and a bit on myself too. Of course, when you have experience and when this is how I should prepare the lap and how I should push in the lap, then it just comes naturally.
Under the heading of it's probably impossible to drive the perfect lap, even one lap. I don't know if you would agree with that, but if it is, what would you say has been your best single lap this year?
My
race or qualifying?
Best single lap, I would say Suzuka probably, back with Manor in 2016. And this year I would say it's an FP1 lap in Red Bull Ring actually.
Tell me about that lap at the FP1.
FP1, yeah, it was. I told the engineers, I've been pushing the car a bit too early, too quick. I was very close to the edge, and yeah, we were quite good in the top 10, and I had quite a margin over Checo. But then I knew, everything would come back closer, because normally, the driver build up during the weekend, and somehow I felt confident to push hard.
And that was perfect use of the curbs,
yes,
in terms of in and out of the corner,
exactly.
And the apex.
Yes, and
wow,
it was very close, to those yellow sausage where you break the front wing.
Yeah,
and yeah, I was perfectly on the edge everywhere.
Can you put into words how this team operates? It's all about maximizing everything you have. That's the feel you get when you walk around the factory. You see the little canteen, the car park. Nothing is lavish, but everything works beautifully when it comes to race day.
But I think you overall said it perfectly. This team puts only the effort on what's needed, and what's needed is the performance on track. And for example, people say, yeah, your gym is very tiny, but I went training in here in Silverstone in the factory, and you have all you need, and it's the same everywhere. You will find everything you need.
A race team is a race
extra.
Team.
Yeah, it's a race team, and we push for the performance, and you don't need anything else.
Let's hope the Force India emerge from the August break fully recharged and every bit their old selves. P4 means that they've only been bettered over the past 2 seasons by the big budget Mercedes, Ferrari and Red Bull teams. And that means that everyone at the Silverstone base deserves much, much more. In closing, our thoughts are with the family of Sergio Marchionne and with all those who work with him. In a relatively short time, he made a huge impression at Ferrari and in Formula One. He was strong, he was passionate, and he was a people's man. He was, in short, exactly the sort of leader of which Enzo Ferrari would have approved. Ferrari finished 2-3 last weekend with both Seb and Kimi wearing black armbands, and from here on, their season, you can be sure, will be charged with a new kind of emotion and a different sort of need to win.